Welcome to Coffee with Joe for Thursday, November 4th, 2010. Joe, how you doing
Salute, Pete.
down there?
Salute. Good.
Joe, we said in the last video that we were going to talk about Mervyn King's speech, the head of the Central Bank of England, the Bank of England, where he talks about the need to abolish fractional reserve banking as a stability measure,
Wow.
which is
Yeah,
just kind of
really.
amazing that it's coming from that high a level of the so-called monetary establishment.
Right. Okay.
But there's not a whole lot more to say about that, other than that that's just remarkable, and maybe that he doesn't suggest a way to create the money that was being created by fractional reserve banking. We can get into that some other time. There's been a lot of news on the U.S. monetary policy this week. In fact, we blogged, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, about Bernanke's failed monetary policy, and he's at it
Right.
again, having announced yesterday that the Fed is going to start up this second round of quantitative easing. Some people would question that it's maybe more than the second round of quantitative easing, but he's announced that they're going to
Right.
buy $600 billion of Treasury securities over the next year. Now, a lot of monetary reformers talk about the U.S. federal deficit, and we need to say that there's been an election this week, and
Yeah.
the House of Representatives is going to have a new speaker. That's going to be John Boehner, and he has announced in his victory speech 2 days ago that the days of free spending in the U.S. Congress are over. There's going to be a start of austerity measures. So now there is a relationship between the federal deficit, federal government spending, and the economy. And a lot of monetary reformers, in particular, I think the Zeitgeist movie, sort of get this wrong, as I understand it. They talk about that when that the U.S. deficit is actually creates the money supply, and I think Zeitgeist actually shows the U.S. Treasury selling their debt to the Fed for new money. In reality, most of the time, as I understand it, the U.S. Treasury sells their debt to the primary dealers who, maybe not coincidentally, own the Fed, but they sell
Right.
them to the
Right.
primary dealers, and then normally the primary dealers sell them into the economy to investors, perhaps international investors. But that's
Exactly.
for money that's already out there. It doesn't actually create new money most of the time. What it
Right.
does is, as I'm starting to look into this, as I understand it, it sort of increases the velocity of money a little bit, which is similar to increasing the money supply, but technically not the same thing, because it's taken somebody's money out of their bank account and it's putting it in the hands of the US government, and it gets it into the economy, out of its locked up place in
Right.
savings and into the
Right.
economy.
Right.
Not
Exactly.
not actually technically creating new money. Now, when the Fed does quantitative easing, it creates money out of thin air and buys, in this case, Treasury securities. The first round of quantitative easing mostly bought stressed
Yeah.
mortgage
Other
securities.
stuff. Right.
I always worry about the skyrocketing U.S. debt, and I always wonder what's the thing that's going to that's going to prevent this line from going straight up, which it pretty much has been going straight up in the last couple of years.
Yep.
We know Bush doubled the debt, and it's been going up at an even faster rate under Obama. What's going to stop that? One of the things I always think of is, what if they held a Treasury auction and nobody showed up
Right.
to buy the
Right.
debt?
Right.
Well, that hasn't happened yet. There seems to be plenty of demand for U.S. Treasury debt. And I always thought, if the Treasury ever holds an auction and nobody shows up, the Fed will show up then and buy the
Right.
debt, create money out of thin air, buy the debt then. It may not be a good sustainable practice, but it would get us through the week. It would prevent the U.S.
Right.
Treasury from defaulting, and it would get us through the week. But that's not why Bernanke is buying this debt. I
Right.
do want to read, he's got an op-ed in the Washington Post today, and I just want to read his logic to you here. Easier financial conditions will promote economic growth. For example, lower mortgage rates will make housing more affordable and allow more homeowners to refinance. Lower corporate bond rates will encourage investment. And higher stock prices will boost consumer wealth and help increase confidence, which can also spur spending. Increased spending will lead to higher incomes and profits that, in a virtuous cycle, will further support economic expansion. Now, one thing he doesn't say is that this is the one way that the US Treasury can sell its debt and actually increase the money supply, because the Fed is creating money out of thin air and spending it on these US Treasuries. It actually is just the simplest way that we have, because we don't have a way for the Treasury just to create currency, at least we don't think we do, to
Not
increase the
today.
money supply. But he doesn't say anywhere about that he's using it to increase the money supply.
Right. One of the interesting things, Pete, about his comment is he says it's aimed at controlling deflation in terms of price stability,
He
not
does say
inflation. So
that.
to the monetarists, that's what he's really doing. That's what he has to really do. And he doesn't say that, although he talks a little bit about it'll affect the money supply, but he's not allowed to say that directly. Well, what we're really trying to do is to increase the money supply, because this does increase, as you said, the money supply, Pete. Um, uh, for simplicity in terms of thinking about what he's doing, I think there's going to be 1.2 trillion or something in the 2011 budget of borrowings, and this is 600 billion, approximately, half of that. And you could say that that money is going to go, yes, directly be created and go directly into bank accounts. Why? Because they're going to give it to the government spend it. The government's operating budget. It's the annual operating budget. The government's not going to save it. So, yeah, that money goes directly into the economy. Now, Pete, given the way the Fed Act is written, given the way the fractional reserve banking system is set up, there's not much else that the Federal Reserve, as the central bank of U.S., can do except this. And in a way, this is as close as it comes to being real monetary policy, because it does directly result in increases in the M1 and the M2, because we're going to spend it into existence. It's going to go into bank accounts. It's going to be part of the real economy. But the tragedy of the commons here is, because we don't understand the money system, we're going to borrow that money. That is to say, that money is going to be a debt. And even though the Federal Reserve is going to provide it, at some point, it's either going to have to pull it back from the economy, take it back, as all debt money is created, it will be extinguished, or it will be sold and replace other savings. The point being that it's because of the failed system, and that's where, Pete, if you want, to contrast it with the really truly structural reforms that are being proposed by Governor Mervyn King of the Bank of England. He's saying, all this other stuff is not really going to provide any stability to the economy. And in order for to have a stable economy, we need to make structural changes. And he calls upon, the consideration of narrow banking. Yeah, the Volcker rule. There's all this talk now. We're going to lose the Volcker rule to the Republican takeover, and the Volcker rule is mamby-pamby stuff when it comes to the needs of the national economy and the monetary system, Pete. So no, what we need is the kind of structural reform Mervyn King's talking about. We don't get it with Bernanke's proposal. What we get is kicking the can down. This is the kicking the can down the road part of it, Pete. Okay, that's what this is. So you say to yourself, what is the real effect? Increasing government debt. Increasing government debt. And now let's contrast that, not even with Mervyn King's, but with Dr. Yamaguchi's proposal, okay, which is to eliminate government debt. And how? To issue money debt-free. Pete, if back to Thomas Edison's, point, if the government can issue a debt, it can issue the money. It's just as sound to issue the money. The lack of a permanent money system, Pete, we're always back to the fact that the debt money system creates and destroys money and therefore needs more debt in order to keep going. We're in a totally risk-averse and therefore debt-averse national economic situation. That's all there is to it, Pete. That's all there is to it. People don't want to borrow. Nobody wants to borrow. The federal government shouldn't want to borrow and doesn't want to borrow, but it's tied by its, legal requirement under its budgeting rules to issue debt for the balances that aren't taxed. And that's part of the thing that has to be abolished. But imagine if instead of doing that, recognizing that what we really need to keep the economy going, and Bernanke's doing that. Bernanke's recognizing that in order to keep the economy going, Pete, we need to actually increase the money supply. He's recognizing that. But how's he doing it? He's increasing the money supply by directly buying the government debt out of newly creating money, but still creating government debt, which is totally unnecessary.
Joe, we're out of time for this week.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of stuff next week.
Yeah,
Thanks
the way
for your
things are going,
comments.
Pete. Okay.